The snow had started to fall lightly as Clara packed the last of the groceries into the back of the SUV. The forecast had predicted a severe storm, and she wanted to make sure they had enough supplies to last the weekend. Daniel had been called away for work at the last minute, leaving her to head up to the lodge alone. She wasn't thrilled about the idea of spending the weekend in the mountains by herself, but Ethan had offered to come along. "You sure you don't mind?" Clara asked, turning to Ethan as he loaded his duffel bag into the car. "Nah, I could use the fresh air," he replied with a shrug. "Besides, it'll be nice to get out of the city for a bit." Clara smiled, grateful for the company. Ethan had always been a quiet kid, but over the years he had grown into a thoughtful and responsible young man. At 22, he was tall and lean, with his father's sharp features and his mother's piercing blue eyes. Clara had always felt a special bond with him, even though he wasn't her biological son. She had married Daniel when Ethan was just 10 years old, and over the years, she had done her best to fill the void left by his mother's absence. As they drove toward the lodge, Clara's mind wandered. She thought about the early days of her marriage to Daniel, how hopeful and in love they had been. But over time, the cracks had begun to show. Daniel's long hours at work, his emotional distance, and his inability to truly connect with her had left her feeling lonely and unfulfilled. She had tried to talk to him about it, but he always brushed her off, saying he was doing what he had to do to provide for the family. Is this what it's always going to be like? Clara wondered, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. Am I just supposed to accept that this is as good as it gets? She glanced over at Ethan, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. She wondered what was on his mind, but decided not to pry. They had always had an unspoken understanding, a mutual respect that allowed them to coexist without too much drama. But lately, she had noticed a change in him. He seemed more distant, more reserved, as if he were carrying a weight she couldn't see. "You okay?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, just thinking about what?" He hesitated, as if debating whether to share. "Just life, I guess. Sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in this loop, you know? Like I'm just going through the motions." Clara nodded, her heart aching for him. She knew exactly how he felt. "I get that," she said softly. "But you're young, Ethan. You have your whole life ahead of you. You'll figure it out." Ethan didn't respond, and the car fell silent again. Clara couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had always tried to be there for Ethan, but she wondered if it had been enough. Had she done enough to help him navigate the challenges of growing up without his mother? Had she been the kind of stepmother he needed? By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full force. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling in every direction. Clara sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, while Ethan added more logs to keep the flames alive. "It's really coming down out there," Ethan said, glancing out the window. Clara nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "I hope Daniel's okay. He said he'd call when he got to the hotel, but I haven't heard from him." "He's probably fine," Ethan reassured her. "You know how he gets when he's focused on work." Clara sighed, knowing he was right. Daniel had always been a workaholic, often putting his career ahead of everything else. It was one of the things that had driven a wedge between them over the years. She loved him, but sometimes she felt like she was competing with his job for his attention. Why does it always have to be like this? Clara thought, her chest tightening with frustration. Why can't he just be here? Really, be here? As the night wore on, the temperature inside the lodge dropped. The fire was the only source of heat, and even that wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay. Clara shivered, her teeth chattering as she huddled under the blanket. "We should probably share blankets," Ethan suggested, his voice hesitant. "It'll help conserve body heat." Clara hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The idea of sharing blankets with Ethan felt too intimate, too personal. But the cold was unbearable, and she knew he was right. "Okay," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. Ethan grabbed a few more blankets and draped them over the couch. He sat down beside her, his body close but not touching. Clara could feel the warmth radiating from him, and she couldn't help but lean in slightly. Better, he asked, his voice low. Yes, she replied, though her heart was racing. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and emotions. Clara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was feeling. She cared for Ethan. Of course she did. He was her stepson, the boy she had helped raise. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite name. A pull. A connection that went beyond the boundaries of their relationship. This is wrong, Clara thought, her stomach twisting with guilt. He's your stepson. You can't feel this way. But the more she tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. She couldn't deny the warmth she felt when he was near, the way her heart skipped a beat when he looked at her. It was confusing, overwhelming, and she didn't know how to handle it. The hours passed slowly, the storm raging outside while Clara and Ethan sat in silence. The fire crackled in the background, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Clara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Do you ever feel like you're just stuck? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the question. What do you mean? Ethan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the flames. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions, like I'm not really living. Like nothing I do matters. Clara's heart ached at his words. She knew exactly how he felt. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, she said carefully. But it's up to us to find something that makes us feel alive. Ethan nodded, but he didn't say anything. Clara could see the pain in his eyes, and it broke her heart. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but she didn't know how. What can I even say? She thought, her chest tightening with helplessness. How do I help him when I can't even help myself? The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Clara's mind drifted back to the early days of her marriage to Daniel. She had been so hopeful then, so sure that they were building a life together. But over time, the cracks had begun to show. Daniel's long hours at work, his emotional distance, and his inability to truly connect with her had left her feeling lonely and unfulfilled. Is this what it's always going to be like? Clara wondered, her hands tightening on the blanket. Am I just supposed to accept that this is as good as it gets? She glanced over at Ethan, who was still staring into the fire. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. She had always tried to be there for him, but she wondered if it had been enough. Had she done enough to help him navigate the challenges of growing up without his mother? Had she been the kind of stepmother he needed? Ethan, Clara said softly, breaking the silence. I know things haven't been easy for you, and I just want you to know I'm here for you. Always. Ethan turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. I know, he said quietly, and I appreciate that more than you realize. Clara's heart skipped a beat at his words. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at her, that made her stomach twist with unease. What is he trying to say? She thought, her mind racing. What does he want from me? As the night wore on, the tension between them grew. Clara could feel the weight of Ethan's gaze on her, and it made her skin prickle. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the fire, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Finally, Ethan spoke. Clara, there's something I need to tell you. Clara's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes locked on hers. I have feelings for you. More than just stepmom and stepson feelings. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that Ethan cared for her, but she had never imagined it would go this far. Ethan, I know it's wrong, he interrupted, his voice trembling, but I can't help how I feel. You've always been there for me more than anyone else. And I can't stop thinking about you. Clara's mind was racing. She didn't know what to say, how to respond. She cared for Ethan, but this was too much. Ethan, we can't, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. It's not right. Ethan nodded, his expression pained. I know, but I had to tell you. Clara's chest tightened with guilt and confusion. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but she knew she couldn't. Not like this. Not now. What have I done? She thought, her stomach churning with regret. How did we get here? She thought back to all the times she had tried to be there for Ethan, to fill the void left by his mother's absence. Had she crossed the line without realizing it? Had she given him the wrong idea? Ethan, Clara said softly, her voice trembling. I care about you. I really do. But this isn't right. We can't do this. Ethan's expression hardened, and for a moment, Clara thought he might argue. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I know, he said quietly. I needed you to know how I feel. Clara's heart ached for him. She wanted to say something, anything, to make this easier for him. But she knew there were no words that could fix this. What happens now, she thought, her mind spinning with uncertainty. How do we move forward from this? The next morning the storm had passed, but the tension between Clara and Ethan remained. They packed up the car in silence, the weight of Ethan's confession hanging over them like a dark cloud. Clara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted between them. What happens now? Clara thought, her hands trembling as she zipped up her suitcase. How do we go back to normal after this? She glanced over at Ethan, who was loading the last of their supplies into the car. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided her gaze. It broke her heart to see him like this, but she didn't know how to fix it. Ethan, Clara said softly, breaking the silence. We need to talk about what happened last night. Ethan froze, his back stiffening. What's there to talk about? He asked, his voice tight. I said what I needed to say. You made it clear how you feel. Clara's chest tightened with guilt. It's not that simple, she said, her voice trembling. I care about you, Ethan. More than you know. But this isn't right. We can't let this ruin everything. Ethan turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and frustration. You think I don't know that, he snapped. You think I wanted to feel this way? To put you in this position. Clara flinched at his words, her heart aching for him. I know you didn't, she said softly, and I'm not blaming you. But we have to figure out how to move forward from this. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how to do that, he admitted, his voice breaking. Every time I look at you, I feel like I'm drowning, and I don't know how to make it stop. Clara's eyes filled with tears at his words. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but she knew she couldn't. Not like this. Not now. What have I done? She thought, her stomach churning with regret. How did we get here?